Okay, well, we're a minute over time, so I think we'll make an effort to start right here, and I can still see the number of attendees climbing up as people start to get connection and join us. But welcome to the DFI webinar. We're very, very lucky today to have one of the experts in the field of gender and one of our teachers as well from the DFI gender course, so Roxani Cristalli. She's going to take us through some research she's been doing on the financial journey of refugees. Just to remind everybody, the webinar is being recorded and we can share with you afterwards. So if you do just get disconnected or something like that happens, or you want to listen to it again because you enjoyed it so much the first time, you will be able to share and see the webinar. And just for us as well, if you could make sure that you type your questions for Roxani in the Q&A function that appears on the bottom screen for yourselves. Roxani is going to talk for around about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have time afterwards for Q&A at the end, so you can post what you'd like to talk to Roxani about in the Q&A function. So once again, thank you very much, Roxani, for taking the time to join us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello, everyone. Thank you for this introduction, for another chance to interact with the DFI community on gender. As Sarah said, my name is Roxani Cristalli, and I'm the program manager at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University, where I work on questions related to gender, humanitarian action, and peace building. I'm part of DFI's orbit in a number of ways, including helping DFI think about gender in its work, and also being one of the co-instructors alongside Julie Zollman and Kim Wilson of a course dedicated to gender issues. And so if after this webinar you're interested in learning more, I certainly direct you to those resources, and Sarah and the DFI team can connect you to more of them. If you cannot hear me at any point, or if I'm speaking too quickly, please feel free to use the chat function. Feel free to type your questions into the chat function at any point, knowing that, as Sarah said, I will speak for about the first 20-25 minutes, and we will get to all of the questions afterwards. So if you typed your question at minute 3 and we didn't get to it, we're not ignoring you, rest assured. So what I will be speaking about today, as the slide suggests, is the financial journey of refugees through the standpoint of gender. And the work that I will be presenting is partly ongoing and partly part of a published paper. You can see the paper here on the right. And if you're not able to access the paper, I am happy to email you an ungated free copy, since the paper is in an academic journal and therefore behind a paywall for some of you. So the paper is called "I Followed the Flood," which is a quote from one of our interviewees, and you'll be hearing more about that shortly. A gender analysis of the moral and financial economies of forced migration. And it was published in the journal Disasters in 2017. This paper is based on 109 interviews conducted in July and August 2016. So while the Mediterranean refugee crisis was very much ongoing, which of course it is to this date. And so we conducted interviews with refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, Iran, Palestine. Point being that we were interested in where these refugees were, as opposed to where they were coming from. We did not limit the interviews to only speaking to Syrians or only speaking to Iraqis. So we conducted these interviews, as I said, in July and August 2016 in Greece, Jordan, and Turkey. And we also did a little bit of work in Denmark that's not fully part of this published paper. We specifically picked these points because they were all sites at which there were people on the move. So people at different stages of the journey, some of them at the very beginning, having just fled, some of them somewhere along the way to an aspirational destination, typically but not exclusively in Western Europe. And we were very much interested in that on-the-move component of the refugee experience, as opposed to, for example, refugees who are semi-permanently settled in camps. We were interested in the experiences of people in transit and how they differ from those of others. As you notice in this final bullet point, this gender paper is part of a broader research project on the financial journey of refugees. And Kim Wilson and Julie Zollman, whom some of you may know, are co-investigators in that study. And I believe Kim Wilson may be returning to this webinar series to share some of our other findings from this ongoing work. And so this specific webinar from that massive research project will be focusing on two sets of questions. The first is a question that anchors the project itself, which is, what does the focus on money and financial transactions illuminate about the refugee experience while on the move? What we found is that questions about money and questions about socioeconomic class, which are of course related to each other, were often obscured in discussions of forced migration. And we were really interested in bringing them back to the forefront. A key and potentially surprising finding for some of you, but not for some others, is that asking questions about money was actually less tense and less uncomfortable than we expected. Many of us think that money is sensitive or that money is private, and it certainly is both and can be both depending on people's vantage point. And so we approached this project with a lot of care and a lot of delicacy, aware that people on the move might be afraid or unwilling to talk about money, which we would, of course, entirely respect. But on the contrary, what we actually found is that discussing money, for a lot of them, allowed for a lot of agency over the experience and over the stories they tell about it to emerge. And so being able to recount, here is how money affected our interactions with other refugees or with authorities or with smugglers, or here's what we paid and here's what we prepared, felt like something they had command over and that they were able and willing to narrate. And we were pleasantly surprised by that. So within that, as the other two bullets here suggest, we were interested in two sub-questions, which is how money structures relationships within and among different refugees, but also between different groups of refugees and local and state authorities, private companies, humanitarian actors, but also informal actors who are very much part of refugee economies, such as smugglers. How money structures agency and how money structures vulnerability. And we really, really care about that and, agency and vulnerability. In part because money is often discussed negatively, what happens if you don't have it, but not discussed positively as a facilitator in refugee experiences, but also beyond. And then the second question is about how money and socioeconomic class create and reinforce hierarchies among refugees. A really key tenet of this whole project has been to look beyond refugees as a class, as a label, as a group, and to really look at the differentiation of experiences within different types of refugees, looking at the role of ethnicity, the role of socioeconomic class, and, as this webinar highlights, the role of gender. So the final bullet on this slide asks, what we're really going to focus on within this broad focus on money and financial transactions is what a gender analysis of refugee crisis would reveal if one expanded the focus beyond female refugees and beyond acts of physical violence. So very often when we say we're going to talk about gender and refugee crisis, people assume we will be talking about women refugees. And the answer is yes, and. We're also talking about male refugees as gendered subjects. So how does the experience of being a man affect people's experiences and outcomes while in the move? We're also talking about relationships. So things like, how does being a family unit or not? How does being a single woman on the move affect people's experiences? We're talking about interactions with formal and informal authorities. So for example, do different groups of men or different groups of women get treated the same way by the police? We're talking about the intersection of gender and ethnicity. So would a Syrian woman and an Afghan man, or a Syrian woman and a Syrian man, have similar or different relationships, and how? And we're also talking about gender beyond acts of physical violence. Rightly so, much of the discussion on refugee experiences has been heavily focused on sexual violence and other acts of violation that refugees experience on the move, or indeed the violations that prompted refugees to flee. In this webinar, and specifically through this focus on gender, money, and financial transactions, we're seeing how are financial transactions and gender part of that agency vulnerability spectrum that I was talking about earlier in ways that go beyond physical violence. So what I'm going to do is share with you some of our interesting findings from some of this ongoing work. And some of these I will very clearly tie to implications for practitioners, being a practitioner myself and being in conversation with them through a lot of my work, even though I'm also simultaneously a researcher and situated within academia as well. And some of these findings I'm just going to leave out there and see how do you respond to them. And if you are indeed a practitioner, what do you think they raise for your work? What surprises you about them? And so on. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are how finances affect the order and configuration of migration in gendered ways. And so how people flee and with whom has to do with both gender and money. On the right-hand side, you're looking at one of the maps that one of our interpreters who helped us on this study drew alongside with a refugee to sketch out their journey. So this refugee said, "2 of my sons left 10 months before the rest of the family. They're now in Germany. Sometimes they would send money via the Hawala. Not a whole lot of money, 280 euros, 300 euros, but we wait and it adds up. The money sending from Germany to Syria got complicated and slowed down a lot. It was easier when my sons made the journey because the borders were open. It took them 1 month total from Syria to Germany. If we had the money to go with them," referring to him and his wife, "we would go, but it was too expensive. So we sent the big boys first, and now the little one, my wife and I follow." This is a very, very common experience with twofold implications. The first implication is family separation, wherein families tended to send adult, able-bodied males to the extent possible first, so that they could get a job, hopefully, and send remittances back to the rest of the family in order to enable their flight. This meant the family was separated, and of course, with border regulations changing, informal crossings changing, passage becoming harder over time, that family separation was not temporary, but often protracted and often continues to this date. Now, this family separation has implications both on the men who left earlier, who are not really able to set up a livelihood on their own terms in the place where they have resettled, since a lot of their money is going towards remittances, right, to support the rest of the family in their flight. And of course, for the family members left behind, and the ways in which they have to have a job and generate a livelihood to support those left behind. The second implication of this is that for the women fleeing alone, so for example, if you're the only daughter in a family with elderly parents, or as other women said to us, male partners who were in the armed forces or in a rebel group, essentially meaning that the women had to flee alone, or whatever circumstances in each case put the women on the road by themselves. This meant that they were often surrounded by groups of men, which of course affects their experience on the road in particularly gendered ways. The second finding related to that is that interactions with smugglers involve male-male transactions and do create gendered risks. I'm going to pause here and say that I use the term smuggler because that is the term that our interlocutors used. And what we found is that for our research participants, there was very little judgment passed on smugglers either way. They treated them as an actor, often as a necessary actor, as a key in the chain of forced migration, as opposed to an illegal actor who ought to be condemned or a savior who enabled their journey. We certainly heard narratives on both sides of that spectrum, but more commonly than not, people spoke about smugglers matter-of-factedly as the way to move forward, and therefore I echo that approach in the narrative here. And so we take a look at this narrative by the Syrian woman. The smugglers aren't used to dealing with women, but they take her money like other people's money. They sometimes try to talk to my son, but I said, no, you're dealing with me. Why is this significant? Because for a lot of the women on the move, per what I just said in the previous slide, this might have been one of the first opportunities to make financial transactions and to negotiate and to deal with formal and informal authorities around the topic of money. We take a look at another narrative from an Afghan man in Greece. When we were getting closer to Turkey, the smugglers were worried the younger boys in particular would flee without paying them. So they had the guards stay up to make sure nobody left at night. They separated the men and the women. They had the single men call their families, and then they would beat them so the families could hear and promise they could make the payment. This highlights a really key theme of the research that I will return to as this slideshow wraps up, which is that we very often think of gender and vulnerability as equating women. So we think about women's vulnerability, we think about vulnerability as being feminized. But what a lot of this journey and a lot of this research has revealed are all the ways in which men are vulnerable to particular forms of violence, abuse, mistreatment along the way. And that's a gendered finding too that requires our attention. Of course, conducting a gender analysis of the financial journey of refugees, we asked about female smugglers. And I'm very partial to this quote from a key informant in Greece. And I should say we classed as key informants humanitarian practitioners, NGO leaders, anyone whose mandate was to work with refugees in a professional capacity. So this person said, a female smuggler, that would be like a black polar bear. So what's interesting to us is that even though women were part of these transactions as refugees, and even though there were women in the orbit of smugglers, the smugglers themselves were quite often male, the transactions were male-male, and when women had to engage with them, this raised interesting questions. The third finding is that financing the journey required preparations and a variety of coping strategies along the way, all of which are themselves gendered. So one potentially surprising but important finding is that even when fleeing in an emergency, preparation is required. So we have this image that people flee because a building is burning and they run out. And for a lot of our research participants, that's certainly the case. But at the same time, particularly as the war in Syria and Iraq was ongoing, or for those of them who came from Afghanistan over time, a lot of them had been thinking about leaving and been making the financial preparations to leave for a long time. And so that often involved liquidating assets, selling furniture, selling washing machines. And you can imagine that for those who had less access to liquid assets, so for example, if your livelihood depends on livestock and you're trying to sell livestock in the middle of war, or if you're a cabinet maker, as some of the people we met, or a carpenter, no one's buying fancy carpentry in the middle of war. So for those people, the financial cost of trying to leave and setting yourself up well for that initial departure was actually harder to bear, which of course had repercussions along the way, right? So it meant they sometimes took less safe routes because those smugglers were cheaper, or they paid for the boats that didn't have life jackets. So again, thinking back to how does money and social class structure refugee experience, that is one way. Which way you flee, how comfortably, how safely, how much help can you afford, how much information, all of those are class issues. So for a lot of our informants, as we have in the first bullet, it was not really an option to pay for the entire trip up front. Some of them did, and indeed could afford to finance their flight from, for example, from Syria to Germany all in one go. But for a lot of them, that was not possible. So they had to get from Syria to Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, from Greece to Bulgaria, and paid for each leg as they went. And a lot of that relied on labor along the way, which itself was really gendered. And so here I have some questions that we would ask if we're trying to understand how is the gendered labor along the journey of migration. So while people are on the move, showing up and affecting people's lives. One is a question of who can get which types of work. And so what we found is that for women, it was a lot easier to get work inside the home as caregivers for small children or the elderly, house cleaners, cook, and that people tended to trust female refugees, whereas men faced a lot of trust barriers. And I will return again to the stereotypes that attach to male refugees as we go along. Secondly, men often ended up in prison when caught. So for example, when caught interacting with smugglers, or when their boat failed to launch and they were caught by the authorities. Well, we did hear narratives of women in prison. Men ended up in prison more commonly. This was not necessarily permanently, but it does mean lost wages, and it does mean not being able to hold on to a particular job, even in an informal economy, even without a work permit, because of these interruptions. So these ideas of who is seen as a threat are themselves gendered. The consequences for certain violations are gendered. And there are, of course, as we're discussing, implications on livelihoods, highlighting this importance of taking masculinity into account when discussing gender and refugee crisis, not just the experiences of men. And thirdly, thinking about who stays behind as a caregiver. And so very frequently, for the families that separated, as we talked about in the first slide, it was either elderly parents or women and children who were left behind. And on those people, there was a double burden of caregiving, either for the young or the elderly, at times for war wounded, for ill people, in addition to having to generate a livelihood that previously potentially the other person in the family who has now fled and been the first to flee used to be responsible for. And so looking at these household dynamics and household roles and how they shift during conflict and displacement is a crucial component of a gender analysis of the financial journey of refugees. And finally, for this slide, carrying money along the way itself was rife with information for gender analysis. So more commonly than not, people would point to female partners, cousins, daughters, and say things like, "She is my bank." And that is because women were less likely to be searched when crossing borders, and so they would often carry money for the entire family. Similarly with children. So a lot of people talked about giving children money belts that they would wear to carry the family's resources. So again, thinking about gender as agency, not just as vulnerability, what does gender enable certain people to do is very crucial. Our analysis was very committed to intersectionality, which is a term from Kimberly Crenshaw, as you see here in the first bullet, that refers to how different forms of oppression and discrimination overlap and intersect. This means we were not just interested in gender and sexism, but also interested in the role of ethnicity and xenophobia, interested, as I've said throughout, in the role of social class. And so on this slide, I want to talk about some of those other dimensions that affect the financial journey of refugees. You see here two quotes. What the quotes highlight, and I'll let you read them on your own time, are two key dimensions. The first is ethnicity. So we often refer to refugees in a particular area as the refugees, as though they're a monolith, a uniform group that all have similar or the same experiences, as though they all get along, face the same opportunities, face challenges. But actually, ethnicity was a really big organizing factor for their experiences. So particularly among the non-Syrians and non-Iraqis, there was very much a sense that they were lower priority refugees. As one of them said, we also fled war, but they could not access resources in the same way that the Syrians did, and that often caused tensions, not only in their interactions with authorities, but also between them. And the second factor is gender creating hierarchies, and so particularly male refugees who either did not have children or who had been separated from their families, as I discussed, felt that the NGOs give food to women and kids, the men eat last, as the second quote says. So really feeling like there were very few resources for male refugees. And that, of course, led to coping strategies of different kinds, some of which we would call maladaptive coping strategies. And so this is a key informant in Greece who says it's interesting. All the journalists ask us if we're hearing a lot about the rape of refugees. We've heard some things about rape and we always report them and follow up on them, but mostly we hear about transactional sex and boys who turn to prostitution. The families need the money. We usually hear that from their older family members. There's a park nearby where it's very common. If you go, you will see. And you will notice in the paper itself, if you're interested in reading this, we follow up on this question of maladaptive coping strategies for young men and what happens when they're shut out of assistance. Now, it's really key to say we're not by any means saying that male refugees are more vulnerable than women, or that gender-based violence against women isn't happening, or that women are not facing patriarchal, sexist, gendered barriers along the way. What we're saying is that when a gender analysis ignores or sidelines the experiences of men and boys, that can enhance or entrench vulnerability that they're already facing and fail to serve them or protect them alongside women and girls. So finally, I'm going to close on this question of food for thought, and we can bring it into the Q&A. On the left, you can see another of the maps that were made along the way, a lot of the backwards and forward. So the first is, how do our gendered ideas about vulnerability potentially shut certain populations out of assistance? And of course, per the previous slide, those ideas are not just gendered, they're also ethnicized, they're also racialized. And so thinking about whom do we imagine as vulnerable and as a priority, and what happens if you don't fit that imagination? Secondly, thinking about gender-sensitive budgeting. A lot of the key informants said we can only use our budget on gender for programs on women and girls. So thinking about what are the structural incentives and disincentives to a thorough gender analysis that would take into account family status, household dynamics, and so on and so forth. If you are interested in family status, do ask me about it in the Q&A. We had some fascinating findings on what happens to people who don't fit into ideas of a heterosexual family on the move. Gender-sensitive budgeting, of course, has implications on whom do we imagine as beneficiaries. So if we only think of program beneficiaries or potential clients as women and girls, then we're not doing a full gender analysis that tracks with what we found. Next, we need to ask ourselves, what types of harm are we imagining? So are we just thinking about sexual violence or physical violence, or are we also thinking about things like interactions with smugglers? Who's more likely to be in prison? Who's more likely to be confronted by state authorities? Who's more likely to be labeled a terrorist or a threat when crossing a particular border? Who may be shut out of humanitarian assistance? Who may be taken advantage of through transactional sex industries? So really thinking about harm, not very narrowly, only with a focus on sexualized or physical harms, but more broadly. To consider family separation, coping strategies, not just vulnerabilities, employment difficulties, and the gendered and ethnicized stereotypes attaching to particular types of refugees and migrants. Next question for us to consider, and I'd love for us to look at this in the Q&A, is what spending are we prioritizing in our imagination of refugees' needs? So we heard some lamentation among humanitarian actors about refugees potentially using funds to get a haircut or to buy new clothes, and the suggestion that that was illegitimate spending. And we would suggest that we actually need to question our ideas about what is legitimate and illegitimate spending and how that is linked to vulnerability and dignity. And we'd love to hear your views on that. And finally, looking at logistics that may not appear to have anything to do with gender, socioeconomic class, or ethnicity, but they really do. So for example, a lot of the posted signs in refugee camps or the communication that people received in Greece was in Greek, which is not a language that refugees commonly spoke in that setting. So thinking about translation and who is able to access information that's being handed to them. Similarly, when information was handed out in English, obviously refugees of a certain level of education, socioeconomic class, schooling background, often refugees from urban areas, which, for example, refugees from more rural areas in Afghanistan were not able to access, would be imagined as the beneficiaries of that communication, shutting out others. Thinking about transportation. So interviews, asylum interviews often took place very far from the formal and informal settlements. Women who were not used to navigating public transportation on their own, or people who could not navigate it because of language issues, were actually missing appointments. So if we work in this space, thinking about transportation as a logistics issue that has to do with power. And similarly, SIM cards. Mobile phones proved extremely important to refugees, and I'm happy to discuss the many ways in which they were throughout our research. And so thinking about, where does one buy a SIM card? What do they have to prove about themselves? What language do they have to speak? And so on and so forth. All of these issues had to do with power. This was a quick overview of some of our findings for the sake of the discussion. You can find out more on the financial journey of refugees. The link is here, where we have an array of publications alongside Kim Wilson, Julie Zolman, and our many collaborators. And so you can see we have publications on refugee integration in the United States, the digital financial inclusion of Jordan's refugees, paying migration's middlemen, and many, many more. So if you're interested, I would direct you there. And I'd like to say a big thank you to our research assistants, interpreters and translators, as well as funders who made this work possible. And of course, to the refugees who shared their stories with us and whose experiences are at the heart of this project. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. That was about half an hour, and we have ample time for discussion with Sarah and the rest of you as we go along. Sarah, back to you.
Thanks so much, Roxani. And one thing that struck me listening to you is when we talk about things like gender, we generally think, okay, so we're going to hear all about women. And we're going to hear how vulnerable women are and what we need to do differently for women. But it's really interesting to see that actually there's a lot of issues that only affect men and only affect women. And we're very short-sighted, like as we call your course, but blind-spotted when we think about gender being women only. So I think that's a really interesting perspective that you've given us.
Indeed. And I think another key point here is asking which men, right? Like multiple times I said, well, Afghan men or Iraqi men or Syrian men. So another key takeaway for our webinar participants is that not all men and not all women have the same experience as other people of the same gender. So really looking at what are the other factors that color their experiences.
And definitely, and any of our webinar participants don't understand or never come across the intersectionality, that's definitely worth exploring, because actually it gives you a much wider and diverse way of thinking about differences in people, because that's what it comes down to, is different people will experience different things depending on their ethnicity, their gender, where they grew up, where they live now, just and all sorts of things, really.
Absolutely. And you'll notice we didn't start with a definition of gender on the webinar. That was deliberate, because we also didn't start with a definition of gender in the research project. You can find one in the paper, but we didn't set out to say, this is what gender is, tell us how you experienced it. Instead, we were very curious and went about it very organically to see how did men, women, boys and girls of different ethnicities, socioeconomic classes, sexuality, family status narrate different kinds of experiences, and then we coded up from that rather than having predetermined ideas about gender. So we really looked at, how does gender show up in people's lives, and analyzed that and thought about that rather than imposing our view of it.
I think that's a really interesting and different way. And I think, one of the other things that struck me while I was listening to you was, that we think we know what the refugees' needs are. But do we really? And I'm not sure we do, because we don't have much research like yourselves and that show all those different experiences, and that actually a refugee is never going to have the same expectations and needs. It's always going to be very different. We need to try and find out, widen our view of what we think when we think of a refugee, just to open our minds a little bit. And think of the different, all the different kind of characters that you've spoken about, and many more probably, depending on where in the world you are.
Certainly. And there's indeed lots of research on forced migration. As you point out, much of it does not come at it with a gender perspective or with this type of curiosity about power. And it's really key to incorporate this lens to get at many of the nuances that we talked about.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Thank you, Roxani. So I've got a couple of questions here, and I think the first one from Fahad is kind of similar, really, to what we started to speak about. So your research shows vulnerability of men is far more than women. How could humanitarian institutions and financial service providers try and use the information and make their journey easier and more gender inclusive?
Lots and lots of questions. So first of all, as I said earlier, that we're not saying that the vulnerability of men is far greater than women, right? Women experience tremendous acts of gender-based violence, not just in the context we study, but if you look, for example, at refugees from Venezuela going into Colombia, at the moment. So in a variety of contexts, women's bodies, women's livelihoods, women's relationships are under attack. So this is not about a comparative hierarchical assessment of who's more vulnerable. Rather, it's to point out the ways in which masculinity is relevant to the analysis and to the ways in which men also and boys experience vulnerability along the way. So how humanitarian actors and financial institutions can use this finding is, first of all, don't limit gender programs to women and girls. Some of them will have to be available and customized for women and girls, of course. But when the beneficiaries are limited, either in the practicality, in the budgets and the program design, or in our imagination of who's vulnerable and experiencing harm, when those beneficiaries are limited to women and girls, we're missing the whole slew of vulnerabilities that I described earlier. So that's, I would say, a really key point there.
And why did you choose to do the research where you did, Roxana, in not other parts of the world?
Great question. So I see the question is asking, why did you not extend your sample to countries in Africa? We definitely did. So the paper that I presented, I said at the very beginning, we did not limit by country of origin. We deliberately looked at who is showing up at our research sites. So obviously, because of migration routes, because of how migration routes work, you have refugees of certain ethnicities clustering in certain places and not others, right? But we deliberately did not say we're only going to speak to Syrians, in part because we were interested in these ethnic hierarchies and how ethnicity colors people's experiences, as I said earlier. And so we spoke to everyone that we could at our sites of study, and I'm happy to talk about how we selected those in greater length if people are interested. We were partly limited by language, so the languages that our interpreters or refugees spoke, and given the availability of funding, we would definitely like to be able to address that limitation. If you are interested in the experiences of African refugees, they are discussed at length in the financial journey of refugees, so people crossing through Africa or from African countries. And so I do direct you to that resource. They're definitely in there. And finally, the point on are we focusing just on refugees fleeing war is extremely well taken. We're not. We talk to people fleeing political violence, targeted assassinations, insecurity, all types of instability, not war, very narrowly conceived. And indeed, we did come across some people who would be called economic migrants, being aware that the language of migrants versus refugees and the nuances between the two is very politically tense. And so we did not turn anybody away from speaking to us on the basis of being one, but not the other. But I would say a common pattern is fleeing vulnerability and structural violence, and in many cases, physical violence, regardless of whether that took the form of war, more localized political targeting, or other forms of political violence.
And how many people, I mean, this is my own question, not one of the others, but how many people roughly did you interview over that time? It must have been.
It was 109 people. I can share my screen again if people are interested. I had a little thing. So it was 109 in this part of the study, but the study and the project is ongoing. So there were a lot more that were not part of this published paper. So I specifically spoke to the work that took place in July and August 2016, 109 refugees, but you'll notice there are a lot more in the other outputs. I do see someone wants to know where the link to the study and the financial journey of refugees was. I am happy to share my screen briefly for people to see that if you would like, but you can just—
I can also email it as well afterwards, so I'll make sure that we send you, along with the copy of the video, so send you the link.
Exactly, so it's right here on the bottom, and you can go from there.
Great. And another question from Fahad, moving towards the thinking about payment, and how are they using things like mobile money? Are they using cash? How are the refugees being assisted by the humanitarian agencies, and what you saw? I had a really interesting webinar a couple of weeks ago, Roxani, from GSMA about using mobile money for CVA, cash and voucher assistance. So it'll be interesting to see, what did you find out there on the ground?
Yes, very interesting. So I'll pause the screen share if that's okay for now.
Sure.
Hopefully whoever wanted the link could have
got it.
the slide. Great. So I think you can now see me. So loads of findings. The financial journey of refugees, there's a whole section on payments, how they took place. With relevance to gender and to the topic of this specific webinar, I'm going to focus on three things. First of all, when looking at payments, we cannot only look at formal payments. So if you look at just the formal banking system, you will find some refugees using that. The vast majority of those we spoke to as part of the study were not. They were using a number of schemes such as pay-as-you-go, a guarantee scheme that was a combination of formal and informal payment factors and actors. So you deposit a certain amount of money with a trusted contact in Afghanistan, and then when you reach, for example, Iran, you call and you say you got there, and they release the payment to various intermediaries. So they're extremely sophisticated payment methods, not all of which are part of the formal banking economy, but not all of which are entirely distinct from it either. So we really are seeing a nexus of formal and informal payment systems. So that's the first key insight here. The second is social class prior to displacement played a huge role, because if you could afford to pay all in one go, or if you could afford life jackets, if you could afford the better smugglers, always in quotes, right? People who were known to be more effective at crossings and so on, you face totally different outcomes than someone who has to have a much longer and more protracted journey because they have to stop and work along the way, than someone who may be caught working illegally and therefore face certain consequences, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about refugees and money, we really need to think about money prior to displacement as well, and how that structures their choices. And then the third thing, and I made brief reference to it earlier, is the importance of the Hawala system. So the Hawala being used for refugees to send money back home, for refugees to receive money along the way. So systems that were designed prior to displacement being used while people were on the move was incredibly common. I do see a question from someone saying, you mentioned that refugees were reluctant to talk about money. It was actually the exact opposite, that we thought people might be reluctant to talk about money, but actually in the vast majority of cases, they were quite happy to speak to us about money, in part because it represented a form of agency over information, over a story they were able to tell. And I'm happy to talk about specific strategies if people are interested.
Great. And we've also got a nice question from Elizabeth about ID. Obviously, ID, you know, and the KYC concept is difficult for some people, even if you're not a refugee. But obviously, being a refugee, then that adds a whole new layer, you know, of complexity. So, what type of IDs did you see people using, and how was it a barrier to them?
Brilliant question, Elizabeth. There's so much to say on identification, and I do direct you. We have a chapter on this in the Financial Journey of Refugees, and Kim Wilson has done extensive work on it as well. So I do encourage you to look it up. For the purposes of this webinar, two key things. One is we often think about ID related to conflict and displacement, so people losing IDs along the way, and that definitely happens, right? When you think about things that are lost in boats, or over protracted displacement, or even the circumstances of flight for some of these people, right? That you're not exactly able to stop and gather your documents all the time. But actually, we need to think about the fact that for some of them, they are people who never would have had ID in the first place, right? So when you think about rural populations in conflict-affected areas, far from bureaucratic and administrative centers. When you think about ethnic minorities who might have been targeted had they come forward to those administrative centers. When you think about women in certain contexts who would have been thought to not need ID for any particular reason. So suddenly you have a whole group of populations being thrusted into a setting in which they need identification that they either lost along the way or never had in the first place. So that's a first key consideration. And then the second key consideration is that for a lot of these people, fungible identity, as Kim Wilson calls it in her own work about this and her speaking about this sometimes, is actually preferred to a really solid one. So we've had a lot of people say, well, wouldn't digital ID or blockchain be great for these populations, right? To get around the losing or stealing or stealing identification, losing identification problem. However, these are extremely vulnerable groups who may not necessarily want everyone to know everything about them at all times, right? So a lot of them, for example, were army defectors who would be really scared of having a digital identity that is fixed, even if they were told, oh, it's only viewable by specific actors or it's only for limited purposes. So thinking about who might be afraid of or skeptical about that kind of identification is a really key point. Finally, people were really afraid that if authorities knew that they had access to money, even tiny amounts of money, right? We're talking about the remittances being sent back and forth. They would be cut off from humanitarian aid. So they were afraid that the humanitarian system expected total and abject vulnerability from them, and that if they had any access to money whatsoever, they would lose this assistance that was really vital to their survival and to their journey on the move, right? And so they would be reluctant to show up in formal systems of banking, of documentation in various ways because of this fear. And I think this challenges humanitarians to think about how we think about vulnerability, but also it's a challenge for bankers and other providers of official services to think about how do you include a population that does not necessarily always want to be included. I hope that covers it.
That's a really interesting answer. I've never thought about people not wanting to have an ID for those kind of reasons. We talk a lot about how, you know, digital ID should solve and help a lot of people, but you're quite right. There are certainly people who would rather keep their identification, you know, much more private and not in a digital global kind of way.
Right.
And then we have one more question from Fahad. Asking about key differences, and I guess it doesn't have to just be between Syrian and Afghan counterparts, but you know, just differences between, you know, what kind of refugees have a better chance to cope in the situation that they faced. So you talked about those who have more money often have a smoother and less challenging experience. It's still a challenging experience, but it's less so the more money you have. You know, what about like things like, you know, number of dependents, or one thing I picked up from you earlier, you know, what about if your family structure, you know, is two men, you know, that you're not heterosexual? I'm sure that must also have an impact on the journey as well.
Brilliant question, Sarah and Fahad. So there's a lot to unpack here, so let's take it bit by bit. Family status. So various systems, be it the protection system, the asylum system, the humanitarian system, formally and informally assume and reinforce and prioritize a heterosexual family. And so if you do not fit into that vision, if your life is not consistent with that, you're not legible to the system in a particular way. And that could really cause all sorts of problems for people, particularly for gay couples on the move or for single people and so on and so forth, who would be targeted both on account of their sexuality, but often also not be able to access resources as the family that they felt like, or the family that they were. That's one key point. The second is the prioritization of heterosexual families meant interesting dilemmas for people who were not that in terms of dependence. So people ask, is it easier to have children? Is it easier not to? And that's a tough question to answer in the sense that obviously not having to care for dependents, not having to worry about your children being harmed along the way, not having to feed them, provide for them, worry about illnesses, provide an extra livelihood, all of that was easier for families without children. At the same time, families with children were more readily legible as less threatening particularly when speaking about men. So a man alone crossing a border was often imagined to be potentially harmful, threat, often labeled a terrorist, whereas men with children or men with women and children were received in different ways. So family, I would say, not just in war and displacement, but also in general, creates responsibilities and liabilities and caregiving worries, but it also makes people legible to the system and to other people as a particular kind of subject, which is not just a question of vulnerability, but also potentially a question of agency. Finally, to the question of who does better, I would say there isn't an algorithm, and this experience is horrific for anyone who has to face it. But there are factors that enhance vulnerability for some people, that make some people's journey a lot harder. And those factors have bureaucratic implications. So it's not to say that being Afghan is worse than being Syrian because they suffered more, although some of them did, and then some Syrians suffered more. I can't make that kind of judgment, nor do I want to create hierarchies of suffering. But the bureaucratic implications really matter. So for example, when the asylum office has phone lines for Syrians 3 or 4 days a week, and then on the 5th day of the week, it's all other, it means that you only have one opportunity alongside all these other people, if you're not Syrian, to call into the asylum office. So you see how ethnicity really matters when it comes to access to resources. And some of that correlates with how many people you imagine are using the service, but not entirely. Some of that is rife with imaginations of, as one research participant said, who fled a more urgent war, who suffered more, and so on, to detrimental levels.
That's really fascinating. I mean, you must have found so many interesting insights, like chatting to people and talking to people about their journey, that unless you had that in-depth conversation, you wouldn't necessarily pick a lot of that up just from looking at them on paper or data alone.
Certainly, and that's, to me, a testament to the power of in-depth qualitative research. We, of course, need assessments and surveys and data, but I do think these narratives in all their texture reveal a very different picture. I think it's very telling that very often we came at this by asking people, how did you get here? That was the first question. It was not a very strict, narrow question. And some of them decided to start, well, 7 years ago, I did this, and telling you their whole life story. And some of them said, I took the boat from Turkey, starting from an immediate bit. But in all cases, we just met them wherever they were, wherever they started in the storytelling. We just met them there and moved forwards and backwards. And I think a lot can reveal itself there, both about their experiences and about how storytelling functions in spaces like that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's really interesting people were willing and happy to share those stories with you, because I guess that's important as well, that not everyone will be able or willing to share the stories.
Of course, and we conducted this study alongside Kim and our research team, as I mentioned, and Julie Zollman's been involved in other aspects of it as part of a university. So there are really strict ethics protocols that we have to follow, and permissions related to informed consent and willingness to participate in research. But for us, it was very important that we not make assumptions in either direction. So some people say vulnerable people never want to recount their experiences because that's re-traumatizing. And other people say, no, it's actually an act of agency and it's empowering to retell. And we don't really belong to either extreme. We just meet people where they are. And if they're willing to tell, we're willing to listen. And if they're not, it is absolutely fine. And we don't press the issue.
And those brave ones willing to share are the ones who are helping, hopefully, to transform, how we look at refugees and how we support their journeys as well.
Certainly, and I suppose as we draw towards a close, I think a really important thing to share is people also shared laughter and stories of hope and stories of coping. And so when we think about sharing about conflict and displacement or financial journeys, we think it's all very dark. But actually this research was rife with resourcefulness, creativity, new bonds, new friendship, and hopeful stories. And I think it's just as important to think about that.
Great. We have one last question that's just popped in from Katie. So we've got a couple of minutes, so let's tackle that. She's just asking a sort of similar question that has been before, but how did you find your subject? So maybe you could just, I know you touched a bit on it, but let's hear a little more detail about
Sure.
picking people.
Sure, and we have a really detailed methods section in the open access publication that's on the Financial Journal site, so feel free to dig into that. For the purposes of the webinar, I'll say a few things. First of all, we were very aware of over-researching and research fatigue, and this was not necessarily academic research all the time. We did this work at the time when journalists, humanitarian staff, everyone was interviewing refugees for one purpose or another. So we were very careful to try to avoid the areas that we felt were particularly likely to be affected by this. So we did a lot of work in the informal settlements as opposed to the formal refugee camps in the urban areas, not just in the areas where a lot of these assessments were ongoing. This was not a survey, so it wasn't stratified sampling in that way. It was a lot of snowball sampling. We were very careful to speak to men and women of different ages and of different ethnicities as we went along. It certainly affects whom we end up speaking to, as does, for example, the gender of our interpreters, the language that our interpreters speak, different members of our research team who themselves are of different ethnic backgrounds. So I am Greek. We had people from all over the world. We're able to elicit different responses. And all of that colored whom we were able to speak to. Everyone is cited anonymously in the study. This is not without its own ethical conflicts that I'm happy to speak about another time if you're interested. And so we were focused on documenting their story and triangulating it through whether similar narratives showed up in similar locations, as opposed to standing there strictly with a keyboard trying to assess who's telling the truth and who's lying.
That's really interesting. Oh, and one more that's popped in from...
Sure, I'll take them all.
Are there any key expectations from those refugees with regards to digital financial services? So, can any of the people on board this call who are from that digital financial services, can they do anything to help?
I'll just focus on the really practical bits that showed up, and I alluded to those earlier. One is language. When you go to the ATM in Greece, and the language is Greek or English or German, and it's often in an alphabet or even in the direction of alphabet that you're not interested to read, that's a really big barrier. So thinking about what language is our financial information in at the ATM and beyond is a really key entry point. Things like people forgetting their PIN number. So very often in a lot of settings, they would get a card through which they get their transfer from humanitarian agencies. And because they're frazzled, they're using an ATM, some of them have never used it before, and some of them were completely fluent in ATM use, right? So we have to be aware of differentiation. But for the ones who are less fluent, you're using an ATM, you're frazzled, you're facing the language issues that I just referenced. There are all these people around you. It's a stressful situation. You put in the wrong PIN, the card is gone, bam, you're locked out of your assistance. So thinking about things that are less devastating, if I forget my ATM PIN or the machine eats my card, I have recourse, I have other access to finance, I have other access to resources, but do refugees have that? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to be raising. And thank you to those of you sending me lovely messages via the chat saying the session was helpful. I really appreciate those and the opportunity to be thinking with all of you.
Great. I think today's session was really interesting. We chatted a lot when I was doing the gender course, Roxani, and I remember finding that really interesting. I would have just felt like a reasonably open-minded woman who understands the experiences of, in particular, women, but other vulnerable populations. It was amazing how many blind spots you find, and I learned a lot from that course, and also this webinar. And I think it just coming to webinars like this and just continue to think broadly about the challenges that people face and the vulnerabilities they have, and that are connected to things like sexuality, gender, race, religion. Really, it keeps things focused in our minds when we're trying to reach And a lot of us are trying in particular to reach the, the more vulnerable people at the base of the pyramid when it comes to including them in some sort of formalized financial way. So I highly recommend for those of you who've not done the course to sign up. We've got one happening actually in a few weeks, isn't it, Roxani? So I think the 1st of July is the sort of signing up closing date, and the course begins on the 8th. So if you've enjoyed today, I can only tell you you're going to enjoy the course even more. So we recommend that you join up. And I'm also delighted to say that, Roxana, you talked a lot about Kim. And Kim is also signed up to do a 4-part webinar series with us, which will be starting next month. And we'll have one a month that explores a little bit more this kind of topic and takes it forward. So maybe, Roxana, you'll be a guest speaker on one of Kim's sessions, maybe, and we'll get to see you again.
Yeah.
But we will encourage everyone to look out for that, those webinars, and they'll be advertised shortly as well.
Thanks so much for hosting, Sarah, and for the plug. And thanks to all of you for the great questions, great discussion, for your interest in gender and power issues and how they affect refugees.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roxani. And we look forward to hearing and seeing a bit more of your research again, hopefully sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, Roxani, and bye to all of the alumni. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.